Imagine you are a traveler approaching the grand gates of a castle. Before you can enter, the gatekeeper stops you and asks,
"Who are you?"
This is the first test, authentication, to prove your identity. But once you've shown who you are, there's a second challenge. You're only allowed into certain parts of the castle, depending on your rank. Some may enter the royal chambers, while others are only allowed in the courtyard. This is authorization, deciding where you're permitted to go based on your status. Now let's dive into how this works in the digital world with authentication and authorization using JSON Web Tokens in .NET. We will cover everything from registering users, logging them in, adding roles, and using refresh tokens. And the best part is you can download the complete source code by using the link in the video description below. All right, now let's write some code after hitting that like button. All right, so now in Visual Studio, let's start really from scratch. We're going to build an ASP.NET Core Web API, and we call this thing JSON Web Token auth.net 9, maybe. All right. .NET 9 is the target framework. We have no authentication. HTTPS is great. Enable Open API. Yes, please, because with that, then we are able to test our API. And I am going to use controllers, but we won't have many endpoints, so it's not really a problem to turn this into a minimal API. Check out the info card, for example, if you want to know how to do that. Let's create the project. And now here in the Solution Explorer, I just assume you already know how to build a web API in general. If not, check out this video in the info card here, because there we also built a web API from scratch together with Entity Framework, but we're also going to use Entity Framework here in this tutorial. Anyways, we don't need the weather forecast, so let's just remove this thing and also the controller. And the very first thing I want to do is to show you how to create a custom authentication in general with JSON Web Tokens is the model or the entity, because we will again also use Entity Framework with code first migration to store the user and also the refresh token then later in the database. So let's create a new folder, call this entities, although we only will have one entity, but here now this is our user object. And again, we're going to use Entity Framework, but first I want to use a static user in the controller in a minute, where we just test if things work in general, and after that then we will use code first migration. I think this is a good way to build up on this project here and show you how this can develop. All right, so our user will only have two properties here. First, which is the username, which is by default simply an empty string, and the other thing, well, is not the password, maybe you assumed that, but it's the password hash. So a hash, in essence, well, it will look crazy. There are lots of numbers and letters, characters in general, where our tool that we're going to use knows how the actual password then was built, right? We cannot see the plain text password then later on in the database or in this user object with the password hash, but this is the whole sense of it, right? This is why we are going to use a hash to really secure the data of our user. And by default, this is also an empty string. And of course, I will explain how this password, this hashed password, will be generated. Every day I get questions like, how do I start with .NET, or how can I use Blazor to build modern web applications? I kept seeing the same problem. Developers like you are hungry for clear and practical guidance without getting overwhelmed. And that's why I created the .NET Web Academy. It's not just another course platform. It is a roadmap designed to take you from beginner to confident developer. I've packed over a decade of real-world experience into step-by-step courses, hands-on projects, and a supportive community to keep you moving forward. Here, you will build real-world projects to master .NET and Blazor. You will learn industry standards and best practices, and get help when you're stuck, so you're never learning alone. It's everything I wish I had when I started, because learning alone can feel overwhelming. But with the right guidance, you'll level up faster than you thought possible. So make this year count. Start building the future you want, one app at a time. And right now, to kick off the new year and make the Academy more approachable, I'm offering an exclusive discount on all courses and membership plans. A deal I've never offered before, but it's only available for a limited time, so this is the perfect moment to invest in yourself and your skills. I'm Patrick, and I can't wait to see you inside the .NET Web Academy. So this is our user object. Please note we have no ID so far. Later, when we use Entity Framework, we will also add an ID for the database. And one more thing that we need before we will move on with a service or a controller and the actual JSON web token generation and so on is a DTO, a data transfer object. Again, I've got another video for that. Check out the info card. But what is the reason for the DTO? Well, it's just an object to data transfer object, transfer data, in this case for registering a user, meaning what we're going to add there is the username and the plaintext password in this case for the actual register or also for the login request. I hope you're not too confused already. It will make sense when we are going to implement this together. I promise you that. So now here, let me call this models. And then here we create our new item, which is the user DTO. So user data transfer object. And here now, let me just copy this real quick, paste this here. So we've got the username and then really, again, the plain password for the request, meaning for registering the user and logging the user in. All right, when this is done, we can already start or move on with the controller. I want to create an auth controller here. So right click, create a new controller, and this is an API controller, an empty one. I think best way to learn. So let's create this thing. And again, we call this auth controller. And in here, as you can see, first little fundamental knowledge, we use this attribute here. So we know this is an API controller, all right, indicates that the type and all derived types are used to serve HTTP API responses. And then also the route specifies an attribute route on the controller. So this means each endpoint or for every endpoint, we have to call, well, the base address of our application, which is in this case locally localhost and then the port right here in the as the launch settings JSON. Later, this will be the base URL in essence, localhost 7084, and then API and then the controller name. This is why we see the brackets here. So just auth and then the endpoint route if there is also an extra route specified, and the HTTP request method, get, post, put, or delete maybe. So the first thing we need here is an HTTP post. So we use the attribute HTTP post, and I also add a route, and this thing is called register. So the complete thing would then be localhost, the port, then API, auth, and then register. But we will see that in a minute. And what I want to do here is put first all the logic here inside of the controller. I know this might not be the best practice. We already discussed this in other videos actually. If you need to extract this, use services for that, and we're going to use services later on. But for now, again, to build up on that, make things simple at the beginning, I will just put all the logic in the controller first. All right, so what we got here now is the register method returning an action result with a user object. So what I want here is, in this example project, that the API returns the complete user with the hashed password. So we see the results. Usually, probably you wouldn't want to do this in a real world application, right? But here now, this is a great test, I think. And now the hashed password. Now this is going to be interesting. So how would we do that? In general, what you would want to do, or what an algorithm would want to do that is hashing passwords, is taking the plain text password that the user enters and taking some kind of salt. So any random character string, whatever it is, and then mix this through some algorithm, and then you get your hashed password. And whenever the user is then logging in, we will use the same method, meaning the same salt, the same algorithm, and then the plain text password that the user entered, and then we will compare this hashed password here with the new one the user entered after or on while logging in. I think you get the idea, right? And if they match, then the authentication was successful, right? Logging in was successful. But for now, the big question is, what do you want to use to produce this hashed password? There are a couple of algorithms or tools that you could use. Bcrypt is one of them that might make sense. But since we're using .NET here, we've got something that is already built into .NET, and that would be ASP.NET Core Identity. Now, we're not using identity completely. We will just use some part of it, and this is the so-called password hasher. This is a great name, I think. So let's just create a new instance of the password hasher. And as you can see here, this thing wants some kind of user object, but it is not really necessary, at least in our case, or for this example application. It's not really necessary, because what you can do with identity has lots of power actually, is you can change the way this password is hashed, for instance, based on specific options you can give this password hasher, and also based on specific characteristics of the user object maybe. So that's why they want the user object here. Again, we can put it there, but we're not really using it. So it's not bad to do it, but in our case, it doesn't really matter. Anyways, we've got a new instance of the password hasher. And now what I want to do is I want to call this method here, hash password. As it says here, returns a hashed representation of the supplied password for the specified user. So let's use this thing. And here, again, it now wants a user object. So let's just give it the user. And then here, we have to create the user in a sec. And then here, now the entered password. So from our request, actually, this password here, right? I told you already, I want to create or use a static user here. So when we test this, we can just use this static user. And let me just add this thing on top. So public static user it is. And this is just a new user. Now we got our user down here. We also enter or use the password, and then the result would be a string, right? A hashed password. And then what we do is we set the username of our user with just the username of the request, and then the password hash, which is now the hashed password. And in the end, we return OK, and then the user. All right, I would say we test this already. All right, so how could we do that? Well, we've got here this HTTP file, JSON web token auth.NET 9 HTTP for this little test client inside of Visual Studio. Well, this would be possible, but I think there's a better way. And before we got Swagger out of the box, right? Maybe you remember, but this is not the case anymore. Anyways, we still have an open API. This means, as you can see here, this thing adds open API services, and then here map open API gives us an endpoint with a complete document of our API in the end. And we can now use a tool to read this documentation or specification of our API and then make some test calls in the browser. I would say we do that, and the new great tool everyone seems to use is Scalar. So let's install this thing real quick. Right click the project and add a new NuGet package, which would be Scalar ASP.NET Core. You see 210,000 downloads. It's really interesting because yesterday it was below 200,000. So you see more and more people are going to use Scalar now. And the great thing now is we only have to add one more line, and this would be app map Scalar API reference. The using directive or the reference is added automatically. And as it states here, maps the Scalar API reference endpoint. Now, how does this work in the end? Well, here now, since .NET 9, you see that in the launch settings, launch browser is set to false. We can either set this to true, or we just copy the URL here and then open another browser window manually after starting our application. All right, there we are. And as you can see nothing here, but there's one thing that we can do. We can now enter open API and then v1.json, and this is the default route, let's say, for our URL for our documentation. And as you can see, here is our endpoint, API auth register, right? And now Scalar can work with that. And the way to find Scalar is just entering Scalar instead of open API, and then also v1. So the same name in essence of the documentation. If you are going to call, or if you want to call your documentation differently, v2 for version 2 for instance, you can do so actually here in the program CS. There you can give this thing a name. Default name is v1, but v2 would also work, of course, whatever you want to name it, and then you would find it right here. All right, so here is now our endpoint. We can again test this really quick. We enter a username and the password, for instance, Peter and Parker. We hit send, and as you can see, now we get the username, and I promised you that the password hash will look crazy. So this is now the password hash, and the next step is now to add a login method where we then compare these two, right? When the user logins with the plain password, of course, and then we will also create a hash and then compare the stored hash with the new hash, and if they match, then this means that the user is authenticated. So this is how this works in the end. So let's implement that real quick. So now let's move to the controller again, and we have another post method using the HTTP post request, but this time the URL is different. So HTTP post, and now it's login. Again, public action results, but this time we are going to return a string because the end result should be, for this part of the tutorial, to return a JSON web token, right? So this would be a string in the end. We call this method login, and again, we are going to use the user DTO for the request. So username and password. And now what are we going to do then? Well, in this example application, we are going to, in the beginning, before using Entity Framework, we are going to use the static user and check if the user names match. So with that, I want to make sure that the user actually exists, right? So if this is not correct, so the user does not exist, we return a bad request with a method user not found. Almost found. All right, like that. And after that, we check the password. So in here now, again, a new password hasher with our user object, or user class rather. Got this thing here, and then we can use the verify hashed password method. And as you can see here, this thing now wants the user, then the hashed password. So we now can get it from our static user, but later then we will grab it from the database, and then the provided password, so the password that the user just entered upon logging in, right? And then this thing returns a password verification result, indicating the result of a password hash comparison, meaning in the end we will see this was successful or this failed. All right, so here now this method, again, our user object, this is our static user, then the user password hash, and then here from the request, the password, like that. All right, and then here, what we want to check is if this thing now is password, oh Jesus, where is it? Password verification result. There it is. When this is, as you can see here, we've got failed, success, and success rehash needed, but these are the two that are important for us. So now if this fails, we actually have the information that the password is wrong. And I made a little mistake here with a parenthesis, but now this should work. And here we can return bad request and then say wrong password. And by the way, please note this will only do that now for this example application, meaning I would tell the user that this user was not found or that this is the wrong password. In a real life application or real world application, we would also check this, but then return just one message that the user or the password is wrong, right? Because otherwise an attacker might know that a specific user does not exist. And when he or she gets this message, this means, oh, there is a user with that username. So now I can just try to brute force or finding the password, right? So this should not be done in a real world application, but again, we're here to learn something, I guess. So let's just do it that way so we see that everything works like it should work. So now here, what I want to do is now return a string, right? This should then be the token. So here, let me just say, we will add another method later on, but here now this is just a token called success, right? So we will create this token or create another method in a minute where we create the JSON web token, and here now we return this token. All right, great. Let's test this now. So we are back, we reload, and now we have to register again because we have the static user, of course. So let's test the request with, again, Peter and then Parker. We hit send. Again, we see the result. And now regarding a login, we can now, for instance, say Peter 1. It's sent. It says user not found. What about just entering Peter? It says wrong password. So this seems to work. What about Parker as the password? We see success. So logging in does work. We know that the user entered the correct credentials, but now we have to create the JSON Web Token. All right, so let's do that next. Back in Visual Studio, we create another method, which is not an endpoint this time. This is the create token method. And this is going to be complex. So let me tell you that. Let's just start. So this is a private method. Right, private string, because we want to return the token in the end. Create token, and here we provide the actual user because the user has some information that we want to put into the JSON Web Token, like the username, for instance, and later also the user ID, and then later also the roles of the user. All right, so here now first, these are the claims, right? The username, ID, role, whatever it is, you can put everything into that JSON Web Token in the end. These are called claims. Right, so here now, claims is a new list of claim, almost claim, and for that we need something, and that would be system security claims. All right, and then in here, for now, let's just add one claim because that's actually everything we got. This is the username. So how would you do that? Well, we add a new claim, and then here we have claim types, right? These are the ones, and now we've got some to choose from, and that would be the name. The name identifier usually is used for the actual ID of the user. But now let's just use the name. So here now, this is our key or the type, and the value would then be the user name. And we can look into the JSON Web Token then when we got it, and then see that the username is there. All right, after that, we need a so-called signing key. Now what's that? Well, let's just write it. So here now we need a new symmetric security key. For that, we need another package. And as you can see here, we got something to choose from. I recommend using Microsoft Identity Model Tokens, but because it's the latest one. But there's actually another package that we also need, and then this package is included into this other package. So let's install this package, and I have to look it up every single time. It's simply called System Identity Model Tokens JWT. Let's just install this thing. So right-click the project, manage NuGet packages, and here now this again is called System. There it is, Identity Model Tokens JSON Web Token. So please write that down. System Identity Model Tokens JSON Web Tokens, and you see it here, 2 billion downloads. So I think this is the right one. Let's install this thing, and hopefully this worked. It seems to be installed. So now back to the controller, and now here, as you can see, we have the reference available. So using Microsoft Identity Model Tokens it is, and from that symmetric security key, what do we want to do is we want to give this thing, well, a key or another token rather, and we will put this token into our app settings JSON files because we have to configure some stuff there. But first, here now what I want to do is use encoding, and then here UTF-8 get bytes. All right, and then here now we need the data from our app settings JSON, so we need the I configuration. We will inject this in a minute. So configuration, and then get a value. No, it's not the configuration binder, it's just the configuration, like that. Get value, which is a string, and then here we say app settings and then token. All right, and we just make sure or say this thing is definitely not null. Now regarding the configuration, we can of course inject this thing with the help of dependency injection, or and we can use the primary constructor here. So I configuration it is, configuration, call this configuration like that, and what this thing is in the end is really our app settings JSON file. So this thing here, all right? So we will add some data there after writing the create token method. So far we got the key, but let me already put this method here. So create token user. This is our login method, right? So here we will create the JSON web token. And down here we have to continue. So far now we have the symmetric security key, which is also our signing key. So the token will be signed with this thing. So later then we can make sure that this JSON web token really comes from our application. All right, now we need signing credentials. So what's that? Var creds, let's say, this is the typical way. And here we say new signing credentials. Yep. And for that, now we need the key for our new instance of the signing credentials, and then also an algorithm. And you can choose, in essence, whatever algorithm you want. So for instance, security algorithms, yep, and then HMAC SHA, but I want the 512 one, maybe a bit more secure. It's just important to note that you need, when you're using the 512 one, you need a token here that has a length of 512 bits, or divided by 8, 64 bytes. All right. So in the end, this means that we need a token that has a length of 64 characters. All right. Otherwise, it won't work. And I will show you how this looks if it doesn't work. Okay, so now we got the signing credentials, and now we need the so-called token descriptor that describes our JSON web token. So here now we say var token descriptor, like that, new JSON web token security token, and here we can enter some stuff. First thing I want to enter is the so-called issuer. So who is actually issuing this key? Again, we use our configuration for that, the app settings JSON file. Configuration, get a value, which is a string. And then here we say app settings and then the issuer. All right, like that. And then we copy this. And now down here, additionally to the issuer, we also have an audience. So who are the users using this token? We have to, or we can define this as well here. So this is now our audience. And the great thing is now when we configure our application then to check that, to see if this is really correct, then it will see if the issuer and the audience of the JSON web token is the same as the stuff that we entered here in our application. All right. So now the claims, which are just our claims, like that. And then here we also have an expiration date. This is pretty important. So for instance, datetime UTC now, and let's say this thing is valid for 1 day. All right. And the last thing now, our signing credentials, and this is our creds objects. All right. I think that's it. Exciting, right? I told you it's complicated. But now we are almost done. Now we can just return our new JSON web token security token handler. And this thing now writes the token with the token descriptor. And as you can see here, whoa, serializes a JSON web token security token into a JSON web token in compact serialization format. All right, so in the end, this is our JSON web token, right? I know this is complex. Again, you just have to do it that way. So when you get this code, remember, you can download the code with the help of the link in the video description. And if you did, if you build this, we can restart the application and just test if we now have a valid JSON web token. So back to Visual Studio. There we are. Let's see if we can, nope, user not found. So let me just refresh this thing. This is a great thing when you have a database. You don't have to create the user every single time, but we are almost there. So Peter Parker it is, we had sent, all right, now login again, Peter Parker, sent, and value cannot be null. This is the security token, right? So let's go back to the app settings JSON. I promise I will show you what the error looks like. So now here in the app settings, I'm lazy. So let me just copy paste this, do this rarely, but this is what you have to do. All right. So we enter the app settings and then we have this token here, the issuer, my awesome app. You can name it whatever you want, name it. And also then the audience. And again, here, very important that this thing is really, really long. Now let me show you what happens when this thing is too short. So let's save this, restart the app again, try this one more time. Of course, the user is not there. Hit send again, not stored, that's interesting. Test again, hit send, login is what I wanted to test. It's sent. This is the other error. Argument out of range, except unable to create keyed hashed algorithm for algorithm HS512. The key size must be greater than 512 bits. We only have 424. Real quick, if you want to level up your skills with .NET and Blazor, now is the time to join the .NET Web Academy. You get over 40 hours of pure learning content. We cover things like clean architecture and CQRS. We dive really deep into all the new render modes of Blazor. You will learn how to publish your web applications with the help of GitHub Actions and Azure, and you get access to our community and the brand new Discord server with live collabs. I'm really looking forward to seeing you inside the academy. So now back to Visual Studio and put this back in, restart the app again. All right, register our user, send. Now let's try to log in, send, and this is our JSON Web Token. Now let's copy this whole thing, and then we go to JWT.io, and down here we can actually enter this, and as you can see now, it knows this is the algorithm, this is our type, and this is our name. So this is the claim, right? Our name that we entered. We have an expiration date, so this is the date, well, 1 day after the current time I'm recording this video, and we also see the issuer and the audience. So with that, you can double check if you're implementing a JSON Web Token. And this is actually the very first step, right? The very first thing you have to do when you want to implement a JSON Web Token authentication authorization. You got the login done, you got the registration done, and you can create JSON Web Tokens. Next steps are, well, moving the user here to the database and then actually using or make use of the authentication in this case, right? So we got a user, but what can we do with this user now? Maybe we should add another endpoint. We can make sure that only authenticated users can really use this endpoint, all right? But as I told you, first, entity framework. So what do I want to do here? Well, we create another folder called data. And to use Entity Framework, we use a so-called database context. So let me add a new item here. Usually you would call this thing something like app or application DB context, or the specific name of your application. Since this is just a small example and we're only using users here, let's just call this user DB context like that. And now here, we can again make use of the primary constructor. And what I want to do is I want to use a certain type that is called DB context options. All right, this thing now wants the user DB a context class in our case, and we can or have to provide some options. Well, these are the database context options, but we first have to install a package, and there you see the suggestion: install package Microsoft Entity Framework Core. So let's find and install the latest version. So this should now work, hopefully. Again, with control and period, we can add the reference now. Yep, error's gone. And we also have to use the base constructor. So this is how we do it. We inherit from DB context and then use the same options. All right, one more thing that we have to do, and this is adding a database set. So this is in the end the table, in that case, of our users. So how would that look? Prop and then DB set users. Nope, user actually. Jesus. User, there it is, this class. Let's add the reference here, and then the name, and this is the name of our table. Usually we just pluralize the name of this class here, so users. This now means that when we make use of code first migrations, that we will create a users table that will represent our user class in the database. All right, but before we can do that, we have to install other NuGet packages. First, the tools, and then since I want to use SQL Server, the Express version, which is free, we also need the SQL Server provider. Now, real quick, before you can make use of this thing, of course, you have to install SQL Server. So for instance, SQL Express, you can Google for this thing, then here SQL Server downloads, and when you go there and you have a fast internet connection, then you will see the Express edition here. Hit download now. And additionally, what I like to use is the SQL Server Management Studio to, well, manage the databases. And there's the link for you. Download SQL Server Management Studio. So please go ahead, do that, download this stuff. And then you can also use Entity Framework with SQL Server Express. Again, totally free. And here now, again, adding the packages for the tools and the SQL Server provider. First, tools. So it should be sufficient, actually. These are the ones, Microsoft Entity Framework Core Tools. And as you can see down here, enables these commonly used commands like add migration and down there, update database. So these are the two that we will use. Install this, please. Yes, we accept. And now SQL Server. This is the one now, Microsoft Entity Framework Core SQL Server. It says here, Microsoft SQL Server Database Provider for Entity Framework Core. So let's install this thing as well. We hit accept. Great. So now we're not done. What we have to do is we have to register our DB context in the program CS, and then we will again go to the app settings JSON file. And I think for the last time, I will copy and paste one thing, and that would be the connection string for our database. All right, so first registration. Down here, we say builder services and then add DB context, user DB context. That's the one. And here we enter some options. Options it is. And here we say options, use SQL, not user, use SQL Server. That's the one. And as you can see now here we have the reference Microsoft Entity Framework Core. This is what I wanted. And here now we again say builder and then configuration. This is our app settings JSON file. And here now I want a connection string. So get connection string. And here we enter, for instance, the user database, that one. And we close the parenthesis for another time. All right, this is our user database. Again, back to the app settings JSON. And now here, this is what we have to enter. First, connection strings, and then user database. And this is how the string looks like. So you got server equals localhost / SQL Express. If you also have SQL Server Express installed, semicolon, and then the database name. In my case, I just used user DB. Then trusted _ connection is true. And then also trust server certificate, set this to true as well. Please use this connection string and then everything should work. Let's save that. And now we are almost ready to use code first migration. Remember, in our user object, we can of course double check here, user, we only have the username and the password hash, no ID. So let's try to add a migration here. Add migration in the package manager console. All right. And we call this initial, like that. Now let's see. Build started, build succeeded, but we get this error. The exception, the entity type user requires a primary key to be defined. So let's add an ID, which will be the primary key prop. And I want to use a GUI this time and call this ID. Simple as that. Again, let's try this one more time in the package manager console. And this time it works. Isn't that nice? And here you see the migration file. You can find it here in the new migrations folder. And this thing says it will create the users table and these 3 columns: ID, username, and password hash, very important. And then here we see this is the primary key. And in case we want to roll back the migration, it would just drop this table. All right, now we use the command update database, although we have no database yet, but this will also still hopefully work. Yep, you see what's happening there. And now let's just move on with SQL Server Management Studio. There it is. Please ignore Blazing Block and Time Tracker. This is from the .NET Web Academy, but we can of course refresh the databases and then we get our user database with this table, DBO users. Column is here, keys are here. And when we now edit 200 rows, we see nothing is there. So now we have to change our code so that the user will be stored in the database. So let's do that. All right, so now we see the auth controller. I told you this is a so-called fat controller because we have all of the logic in here, in particular the create token method. I don't really like that. So maybe we can, well, refactor this a little bit so that it is more clean. And to do that, let's just use a service. So here now, right click the project again, and let's create a new folder. Call this services. And usually I would create an interface first. So with that, then we can make use of a dependency injection in the end. So we will then in the controller inject actually not the configuration anymore, but this time then the service. So here auth service first for the interface. Perfect, public interface. And then here the implementation class, new item auth service it is, and this thing implements the auth service like that. Now in the interface, we have two methods, logging in and registering the user. So I also want to make them asynchronous now because we're going to use the database. So let's use this, almost the user class again. Add the reference, please. And here now we call this register async with a user DTO. Need another reference for that. And here we call this requests. All right. And here now task string could also be null with login async and user DTO requests. All right, now to the service. You see the error already because we haven't implemented the interface. So let's do that automatically first. As you can see, we got our methods, but we have to inject some stuff. The first thing now is the database context. So user DB context it is, and I just call this context here. And then also the configuration, and now we can copy paste stuff from our controller. This is a great opportunity for copy paste errors. So let me go to the controller first. Auth controller, there it is. Register method first, maybe. So let me copy this, paste this down here. See that? Almost the first copy paste error. So here, async, all right. And now we have to change some stuff. Actually, we first have to create our user here, and the very first thing is actually testing if the username already exists. So let's do that. If await the context users, this is how we get to our table. We have the database context, called context in this case, and then users is the database table. And here now we check with any async and lambda expression, we check if there is any user where the username equals the request username. You could also add to lower, to upper, stuff like that, right? So to make or to be really sure, but in this, again, example application, this is totally sufficient. And if this is the case, so we already have a user with the same username, we return null, and then in the controller, we will react to that and then say, okay, if I got null, this means something is not working here. In this case, there probably could only be one thing, and this means that the user already exists. So let's do it that way. All right, now we need a user. So not the static one from our controller. This time we will create a new instance here for our user. All right. And regarding the hashed password, this is in essence the same. We got this user and the request password. Here now we also say username is the request username, and then we also got the hashed password, but now we want to store this in the database. So we again grab our context and the users table, and here say simply add user, but this just means, as you can see here, it begins tracking the given entity, meaning that it is not really added to the database. We changed something, Entity Framework began tracking this change, but we also have to commit it, meaning we save the change with, this time now, await context, save changes async, and in the end, here now we return the user. All right, this is the register async method. Now logging in, again, back to the controller, copy paste errors, here they come maybe. So copy that, back to the, there it is, the service method. Now this looks a bit different now. We don't have this user here, right? So what we can do now is we can check if a user with the given username exists and actually grab this user because we need it. And then we check if this user is null. And in that case, then we return, well, null in the end. So saying that something is not correct here. So first our user. So here var user from the database now is await context users, and then let's use first or default async, again with the lambda expression, because we want to find the username with a given username like that. All right, and now if the user is null, we also return null. All right, and the next step again is using the password hasher. In this case, we again use this user from the database this time with the password hash, again coming from the database. We have the provided password from the request. all right, this thing here. And then we see, or if this thing fails, then we return also null. And now, even if you wanted to, in the controller, we cannot really differentiate if something is wrong with the user or with the password. So we have to return a message like username or password is wrong, all right, in the controller. But first, what we now need is actually the create token method. So first, let me just put this here. So we're going to return the token. All right. And now from the controller, let me just copy this thing, and here in our service, paste the create token method. And there's actually a new claim that we can add now, and that would be the name identifier. You knew that, right? Because you paid attention earlier. So now the name identifier in this case is the ID to string. All right, but we are not done yet. We still have to register the service now. So in the program CS, we write builder services add scoped, meaning with every request, this thing will be created, but only for the time of this request. So auth service like that. So now it's registered. And now, of course, we also have to change the controller so that it is now using the new service, but then everything is clean. So here now, instead of iConfiguration, we actually need the auth service. All right. Call this auth service and add the reference. You don't need that user anymore. Now here we can actually remove all that, and here say var user awaits auth service register async requests. Now if the user is null, we return bad requests. Username already exists. Like that, and otherwise we return the user, and we have to add the task return type here so that the error is gone. All right, now login. Again, we can remove all that and say var token is await auth service login async requests, and here we say if the token is null, then we return a bad request saying something like invalid username or passwords, and again change the return type. All right. Let's test that, I'd say. So restart the application. There we are. Let me just refresh this thing, and now the user should be stored in the database, right? So here we say Peter Parker, hit send, and as you can see now we got an ID, even a username and the password hash. This is amazing. Let's double check in the database. There we are. Right click, execute SQL, and as you can see, there is our beautiful new user with a crazy ID and a crazy password hash and a beautiful username. All right, that's that. And now let's try to log in with auth login, test this thing, or let me first check something else. What if I try to send this again? It says username already exists. Great, this is what I wanted. And now the logging in part, like Peter1, it says invalid username or password. This is correct. What about just Peter? Same thing. And now Peter Parker, and we get the JSON web token. Let's try that again here, and you see now that we also not only have the name, but also the name identifier, which is our ID. Perfect. So this works. But now again, the big question. We did so much now, all fundamental stuff, but now we want to secure an endpoint. So how would we do that? Actually, the first step is pretty easy. Let me add something like that. We have an endpoint here in the controller that is called authenticated only endpoint. All right. So I only want to, or only authenticated users should be able to access this thing. And we just return a string here that says you are authenticated, like that. Okay. Now there is one, sorry, that was my mic. There is one attribute that we can use here. First, HTTP get, so that we know this is now a GET request. And then we can use the Authorize attribute. Now let's see if this is already enough. Restart the application. There we are. Let's just refresh this thing. And as you can see here now, auth. Let's just test this request. We hit send, and it says no authentication scheme was specified. And that's absolutely correct. We have to provide an authentication scheme or specify one. So let's do that. Now, what is this scheme? What does this mean? In the end, it simply means we want to tell our application to use JSON Web Token authentication and use the app settings that we have. And when we get a JSON Web Token, that we compare this stuff and really check if everything is valid. So, well, let's implement the authentication scheme or add it. Again, a bit more complex. So this would look like that. Services, add authentication. And it's not only that, right? This thing here registers services required authentication services. We also need the middleware. This is here added by default in my case, use authorization. And it says here adds the Microsoft authorization middleware to the specified iApplication builder, which enables authorization capabilities. And you have to make sure where this is put. As you can see in the next line, when authorizing a resource that is routed using endpoint routing, this call must appear between the calls to app use routing and app use endpoints, if you have it, for the middleware to function correctly. So I think this is the right place. But now regarding the scheme, what we're going to do here is we add JSON Web Token bearer defaults. And for that, we have to install something. This package here, Microsoft ASP.NET Core Authentication JWT bearer, because in the end, this is a bearer token that we're going to use. This is not what I wanted. I just wanted to install this package. Come on, find and install latest version. Yes. So a bearer token, in essence, just a string. Let's just keep it at that. This is what we have here, and this is what we want to use. Hope the package is installed. Yes, now I can add the reference. Perfect. And then from that, we want the authentication scheme, and here then we add another method, add JSON Web Token bearer, and this thing says now enables JSON Web Token bearer authentication using the default scheme. All right, as you can see here, it performs authentication by extracting and validating a JSON Web Token, JWT token, JSON Web Token. All right, from the authorization request header. Maybe is this a little mistake? Maybe they should update the documentation here. But anyways, I think we get the idea here, and we have to configure this thing. So we provide some options when we are able to type the proper characters here. Options, it's late. You saw it already. It's really, really late. Options, for me at least. I've got 2 small kids. It's, yeah, it's hard. Okay, so here now, options. And then we say options, token, validation parameters. And this is new token validation. Yeah, pretty much this thing here, but let me use the reference on top. So here now, Microsoft Identity Model Tokens, and let's get some space here like that. Okay, now validate the issuer. I think maybe now everything makes sense. We provided an issuer and we want to validate this thing. So we compare the token with our settings. And now what's the valid issuer? Well, again, we can use the app settings JSON file here, configuration, and yeah, get value, or there's actually also another way to do that. We can also say app settings and then issuer. So many ways to write this code. Then valid audience, set this to true as well. And then the validate audience. And then the valid audience is builder configuration. And now it's app settings audience. Okay, lifetime, of course. So the expiration date, also want to validate that. And now we get the key. We need the key, the issuer signing key. So this again is a new symmetric security key. And again, we use encoding UTF-8 get bytes. And then again, builder configuration. And this is our app settings token like that. And this is definitely not null. We're pretty sure it is not null. All right, and validate the issuer signing key is also set to true. Okay, so this is our complete configuration, the authentication scheme. We save this and restart the app. All right, let me refresh this thing as well, just to be really, really sure. Again, test the auth request. I now hit send, and it works. It's telling us that we are not authorized to, well, see what's in there, right? So let me log in now. First, we enter our credentials with Peter and Parker, we get sent, and this is now our JSON web token. And when I now want to access this endpoint, we have to provide the authorization header here. All right, and then the pattern is we enter bearer, because it's bearer JSON web token authentication, space, and then paste the JSON web token. We hit send, and now it says everything's fine. We get a 200 OK, and you are authenticated. All right, and now you're done in essence. But the next step is roles, right? You want to know roles. How would you do that? Because this part so far is just authentication. The user is authenticated. You can enter the castle. Remember, I know it's a long time ago, but you can now enter the castle. But if you also want to enter the royal chambers, maybe you have to be an admin. So this is a role that we want to set. Not that difficult actually. So let's introduce roles next. Back to Visual Studio. There it is. And we have to change our user objects and add roles right here. So public string, or just one role for this example. So role it is, actually a property. So it gets set like that. And by default, this is just an empty string. All right. Now we made a change to our class, our user object. So we also have to make this change in the database. So let's add another migration with add migration, add user role. Like that. And now we see in the migration file what will happen. Well, we just add another column. All right, just the role column. So I think this should work. Update database, perfect. And now when we go back to our database actually, and just refresh this thing and have a look here, we now see the role. All right, but it's empty. Okay, that's fine. But now let's add another endpoint actually to just test if we are able to access it. Now, how would we do that? We go to the controller, auth controller. There it is. And let me just copy that. All right. And now here, this shall be an admin only endpoint. This means that here now I can enter roles. You see that it can be multiple roles. So here I can enter admin, but you could also with commas separate it and put or add other roles there as well. Would be then a bit more complicated in the database maybe, but in essence it would be a list of roles for the user object. Where is it? User, come on, there it is, right? So here it's just one role, but we can also use a list. Entity Framework would do its magic, but I think again for this example this should be totally sufficient. But if you implement it, then just remember that you can add other roles like admin role, user role, whatever you want to add here. But for this example, again, just one role, admin. You have to be an admin to access this endpoint, right? So let's try that now. We restart the application, and now here, maybe we still, nope, header's not there. So let's just log in again. Wait, we don't have the endpoint. So, of course, here now we have to add a route. Good that it happened. Why did we not see the route or the endpoint in Scalar? Well, we have two get methods here, and they can't have the exact same route, right? So this is why we have to at least give one of the endpoints another route, like admin only here. So let's try that one more time. Restart the application. There it is. So let me now refresh. There it is. Perfect. So now let's log in again to get the token with Peter and Parker. Hit send. We have our token here. And now it's going to be interesting. First, we test the request. I just hit send, no header whatsoever, right? This means I'm unauthorized, 401. But now let's add authorization and then bearer with my token. And now it says forbidden. So this means that I'm actually authenticated. Again, I could enter the castle. I was able to enter the castle, but I'm not allowed. It's forbidden to enter the royal chambers because I'm not an administrator. So now let's change that in the database. So here I add admin as a role and hit return. All right, so now Peter is an administrator. Very important, it's not sufficient to just try to run this request again. The token is not the same. So for instance, if I copy that, paste it here and remove the bearer stuff, you can see that we have the name here, the name identifier, but I see no role. So we have to also change the token. How would we do that? Well, we add one more claim to that token. So back to Visual Studio, and here now in our auth service, when we create the token, there it is. Now here we say new claim, and this time claim types role. like that. And this shall be the user role, in fact. All right, so let's restart the application now. Go back to Scalar. We have to log in again with Peter and Parker. We hit send, copy the token. Let me just check it here already. And as you can see now, we have the role admin. All right, and now here in our admin only, test the requests, authorization, bearer, and then the token. We hit send, and now it says you are an admin. And this is how you implement roles. This is actually pretty easy as soon as you get all the or have all the fundamentals. But now there's one more thing to JSON Web Tokens, and these are the refresh tokens. Now, why refresh tokens? In the end, it just means that these JSON Web Tokens, the expiration date should be, or the lifetime of this token, let's say, should be rather short. A day is already pretty long, actually. There are applications that just use 10 minutes, for instance. And what they do then is they add another token, and that would be the refresh token, which is then valid for a week, for instance, or even a month. Right? The idea behind it is that if an attacker has this JSON Web Token, he cannot do much if, well, it will be replaced every 10 minutes, for instance, right? So the damage then is actually minimized. So this means the token, for instance, is only valid for 10 minutes. And usually, if you would not use refresh tokens, then the user would have to log in again as soon as the JSON Web Token is not valid anymore. But with the help of refresh tokens that are valid longer, for way longer time, the user can request a new JSON Web Token. Of course, not manually. The application, the client, is doing this for the user. But this means that the JSON Web Token then is another one. And if an attacker got the old one, he can't do really much because it is not valid anymore. So this is why we change the access tokens, the JSON Web Tokens, more often than, in this case, the refresh tokens. All right, this is actually the main reason to use refresh tokens, let's say. So let's implement that, because this can be a bit tricky, but well, let's just see. So back to Visual Studio, and again, back to our user object, actually. And here now, we have to add two more properties. The actual refresh token, so this thing, string refresh token, all right, and this thing could be null actually in the beginning. And then the lifetime or the expiration date of this thing, so refresh token expiry time, like that. All right, so this means now when even the refresh token is not valid anymore because of the lifetime, then the user has to log in again. But when the application, let's say, automatically requests a new JSON Web Token, then the user will also get another refresh token again. So with that, well, he might be logged in longer, let's say. Okay, that's that. Now, again, of course, we have to add another migration. So add migration, add refresh tokens. There we are, two new columns, fine by me. Update database, and that's it. Let's see, in the database, we refresh our table. Yep, that was the wrong one, this one. There they are. And we see that stuff now, great. Okay, so now we need a couple of new methods in the auth service. We already got the create token method, which is private, and we need two more private methods. First one is generating a refresh token, and another one is generating and also saving the refresh token in the database. All right, so private string generate refresh token, like that. And here now, this is in essence just a random string, okay? So first let's use a random number here, new byte 32. And now with a random number generator, we can create the string. So using, not unsing, using RNG, the random number generator creates an instance of the specified implementation of the cryptographic random number generator. Now here we say RNG get bytes of our random number, all right? And now we return convert to base 64 string, again, random number. So this is then our refresh token. And now private async task string, because we will now here store this thing in the database, generate and save refresh token async with the user. Here now our refresh token is now generate refresh token. And now there's more to that. So our user refresh token is this refresh token. All right. Then we define a lifetime for this thing. So user refresh token expiry time is date time UTC now at days 7, let's say. All right. And now we say wait context save changes async and return refresh token. All right. Now, again, to clarify, any client application now after logging in needs more than just the JSON Web Token, right? This time the client needs to store the access token in the local storage, for instance, and then so the JSON Web Token, and then also the refresh token, because if the JSON Web Token is not valid anymore, then the application can use the refresh token to get a new JSON Web Token and also a new refresh token. So instead of returning just a string in this login method here, which is just the JSON Web Token, we want to return 2 strings. So let's just create a new DTO where we can put both into, you know what I mean. So in the models now, models folder, we add a new item. We call this token response DTO. All right. And here now we have prop a required string, which is the access token. All right, this is our JSON Web Token, and another one required string, which is the refresh token. All right, now the login method has to be changed. So here first, what is the login async method? What it is returning now is not the string anymore. This time it's now it's the token response DTO. And of course, we also have to change that in the actual method. So here now, again, token response DTO. And down here, let's just say var response is now a new token response DTO, like that. And the access token is now create token user, and the refresh token is not create token. This is now generate or await, generate and save the refresh token with the given user, and here return the response. All right, now let's also change the controller. So auth controller it is, there's the login, and here now it's a token response DTO, and let me just rename this to result or response, something like that, and this should be it. Let's test that. So reset application. Okay, now let's try to log in again. Peter Parker, we hit send, and as you can see, we get an access token, great, and also the refresh token. And now let's have a look in the database, refresh, and there you see we have the refresh token and also the expiry time, so the lifetime of that thing. Isn't that nice? Okay, so with that, this means that we have the refresh token, but what now about the actual case where we need it, right? So the JSON Web Token is not valid anymore. We have to refresh it. We have to refresh the access token and also the refresh token. So refresh the refresh token. And for that, we need something else. And the first thing would be a refresh token request DTO with the user ID and the current refresh token. We validate the refresh token, and if it's valid, then we can actually create a new one and then return it to the user. So let's implement that. Back to Visual Studio, another DTO. So add a new item, refresh token request DTO, like that. All right, and here now we got the GUID for the user ID, and then the required string for the refresh token. All right, now in our authentication service, we need another private method first to validate the refresh token. So private async task user, and here we say validate refresh token async. We get the user ID and the refresh token or the request DTO, but we used the DTO on another place, in a minute. But here so far we say var user is await context users, and since we're using the ID here, we can use the find async method with just the user ID. Now if the user is null, the case that this thing is null. Or there are also other options. We say the user refresh token is not the provided refresh token. Okay. Or the user refresh token expiry time, let me put this into a new line, is below date time UTC now, then we return null. So this just means that, well, this thing is not valid, right? And hopefully this work. Yeah, this should work. But otherwise, we return the user. Okay. And now finally, a new method, a public method that the controller can also use to, well, refresh the tokens. So in our interface first, we say we want to return a task with a token response DTO, and it could be null, and we call this refresh tokens async because we're refreshing 2 tokens. Got it? Okay. Refresh token request DTO request. That's the one. Now in the implementation, implement the interface, and it is way down here. Let's put it here now. Okay, great. So now our new user is await validates refresh token async with request user ID and request refresh token. All right. Now, if a user is null, we will return null like that, and otherwise we return wait. Actually, we need these two. Maybe we can extract this real quick. So here now, extract methods. Come on, do it. There it is. Create token response. All right. So here now, actually, let me put this now here because we needed it at 2 places, right? After logging the user in, we need these 2, and when Visual Studio lets me go to the definition, there it is. Now here we can, we can create the access token and the refresh token. All right, and now down here we can do the same thing. All right, and that's it. Now we only have to add the controller method. So auth controller, there it is. Would be another post one. So HTTP post refresh token public async task action results with the token response DTO. All right, refresh token, and with a refresh token request DTO, which is our request. And here now we say var result is await auth service refresh tokens async request, and if the result is null or the result access token is null or result refresh token is null, we say return unauthorized invalid refresh token. Okay, but otherwise we return, let me get some space here. Okay, result. And with that, we should be done with the refresh tokens. So let's test that real quick. And there we are. So now, let's see. We have the login, test the requests. We hit send after adding, of course, the credentials, Peter and Parker. Send. And I got this refresh token here. All right, so let me copy that one, and I want a new one. So here, what I need is the user ID and the refresh token. So this would be the refresh token now, and the user ID. Let me grab that here. Copy. Let's see. Yep, looks the same. And now let's see. What about, well, maybe what if we forget this one? We hit send, and it says request field is required. Okay, so let me just enter a wrong one. We hit send, and now it says invalid refresh token, but the ID is actually not correct. Now let's say the refresh token is not correct. Same thing. All right. What happens now if I change the date? So for instance, here it's not 26, it's now the 18th, let's say. And now I also send it. It says invalid refresh token. So let's change that back to the 26th, like that. All right. And hit send. Now we get the new access token and the new refresh token. In the database, we should see, pay attention here, refresh token and the date, execute, new time, and also a new refresh token. Isn't that great? Wow, what a ride. So this now works. Lots of stuff we did. Again, the source code is available in the video description below. I hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you did and hit the like button. Thank you very much. It means the world to me. And well, I hope I see you next time. And check out this video here about web APIs with Entity Framework in general. I think this is really interesting for you. Happy coding. Take care.